So that's it. I have a somewhat concrete placement of all the flagship Zelda titles with bits and pieces of information and evidence to support this. What's next? Well, first I'm going to start off by saying that all of the Escort titles, they either have way too much content in them, like all these different characters from all these different games, to place them decisively, or they have too little to explain, and it's all up to generic interpretation. Let's start with the first game that deviated from the norm of the main series, that of course being not one, but two games, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. This is where Capcom had begun developing for Nintendo, and I think only a handful of games actually do qualify as the Escort series of Zelda. So, let's look over the story and the state of everything that's here. At the beginning of either game, we clearly see the Triforce's hole, and Link is called upon to check on it. Upon doing so, he's transported to another land, Labrina or Holodrum, and obviously the same thing goes for whichever game you play second. Anyways, let's look at other signs in the game to place it in the timeline. Let's look at the state of Ganon. He's been destroyed, and his minions, Onyx, Varin, and Twinrova, are seeking to revive him by sacrificing Zelda. Well, automatically, this tells me that given the Triforce and Ganondorf, this has to take place at one of the ends of the timelines. And FYI, don't say that the Oracles take place on opposite forks of the timeline, because very clearly, these games take place one after another. When you beat one game and start another, references of your previous journey are made. Now, I suppose a case could be made that the Oracles take place a few generations after Twilight Princess. However, it just feels like a more smooth transition from A Link to the Past, given that Hyrule isn't explored in this game, and seemingly has been in peace for a long time. It just feels like we're finally moving on from Hyrule and exploring new lands, just like in Link's Awakening. Now, I know a lot of purists to Nintendo's official statements will hate me for this. However, it's something that I need to address. Link's Awakening may have been retconned so as to no longer take place as a direct sequel to A Link to the Past. Now follow me here. There's only a few criteria that a Link must follow in order to embark on the quest in Link's Awakening. Firstly, he must know Zelda, which Oracle's Link does, as he draws the comparison between Marin and Zelda. He must have fought Ganon, which Oracle's Link has done. And lastly, he must have fought Aghanim, as both Aghanim and Ganon are in the Nightmare Gauntlet in Link's Awakening. Now believe it or not, the Oracle's Link did in fact fight Aghanim. If you'll remember, Aghanim is the mini-boss of the Dancing Dragon dungeon in Seasons. Very significant, simply because in A Link to the Past, we don't see him die. We simply see him collapse while Ganon leaves his body in the form of a bat. It's quite feasible that the wizard could have continued to serve Ganon even after the Evil King's death. So, it's very fitting for Oracle's Link to be the Link in Link's Awakening. Remember, he's the one to have killed both Ganon and Aghanim. And, of course, he either leaves Labrina or Holodrum on a sailboat, which is how Link's Awakening starts off. Now, again, I'm not going to be too concrete about this, because there's a whole lot of ways that this can be interpreted, but it's just the way that goes well with my theory, that's all. Anyways, all that to say that there's one important reason why I don't think Oracles can take place in Hyrule B, that being Twinrova. Remember the boss at the end of the Spirit Temple in the adult timeline? And we saw them die, and for some strange reason ascend to heaven instead of plummet to hell, whatever. People will point to the quote, "I'll come back to haunt you," as proof that they can come back, but honestly that's a very common saying. We've seen Ganondorf revive creatures and specters of his Dark Army. Phantom Ganon and Dark Link being examples. They were created through magic. We have never seen him revive sentient humans or other such races. If he could, why haven't Onyx and Varin been brought back for recent games? They'd be nice characters that I'd like to see. Twinrova is unique in that they seem to be immortal, at least by aging standards. Hyrule A is left with Twinrova intact, as I'm sure you can recall. So it's quite feasible to say that they stay alive long enough to try to revive Ganon, probably having mistook him for the original from Ocarina of Time, or it could actually be the original from Ocarina of Time. Still, again, there's a lot of speculation here, much more so than the Mothership titles, and that's a consistency you're going to see throughout the rest of this timeline retrospective. These games are a lot more ambiguous and a lot more difficult to place, but I'll still attempt to do so. Now, moving on, 1 year after the Oracles, a concept was created. How can we get 4 people to play a Zelda game at the same time? Well, in 2002, A Link to the Past was re-released on the Game Boy Advance, and a special side adventure was included. This side adventure was called The Four Swords, notable for being the very first standalone title to not have a villain whose name didn't start with Ganon and end with Dorf. Enter Vaati, a strange eye-like creature that actually mildly resembled the Vitreous boss from A Link to the Past. But that's neither here nor there. Vaati was addressed as the Wind God who had been sealed within the Four Sword. Now what's interesting about this title is that there's no mention whatsoever of Ganon, nor is there any mention of the Triforce. And this is possibly the most varied game in the timeline, as some put it before Ocarina of Time, in Hyrule A, or some put it in Hyrule B, and some don't put it in the timeline at all. Now, considering the variant nature of people's perception, I admit you can put this game pretty much anywhere you want, as long as Ganon isn't active and the Triforce is seemingly put to rest, because it doesn't pose a factor in this game. Personally, I find the lack of Ganon significant, so I place it before Ocarina of Time. Again though, you can place it wherever you feel like, as long as it follows the basic logical criteria. 1 year after The Wind Waker, the second installment of Four Swords was developed. Four Swords Adventures is vastly different from Four Swords in storyline, as it features varying components of the series. Vaati is back, but hey, Ganon is here too. This is where a lot of people started to argue the canonical nature of the Four Swords games, but I do think they belong. The issue is, where? Obviously, it possibly should happen after Ocarina of Time, because that's the first Ganondorf recorded in Zelda's history so far. But we need to look at Ganon closely. A lot of people, and even I used to do this, say that because Ganon gains his trident, it belongs between Twilight Princess and A Link to the Past, meaning this is the second Ganon in Hyrule A's history. I still believe that, but I've changed my reasoning to something a little more concrete than just a trident. Why would Ganon need to use Vaati if he has the Triforce of Power? Or possibly the whole thing? Isn't his strength in that state so strong that he can take Hyrule by force? Let's also consider this. The locales in Four Swords Adventures are very closely related to those in A Link to the Past, some being blatant rip-offs. Now, while the rough geography is something I no longer go by, if it's this closely resembling another game, I tend to believe it takes place around the same time period, perhaps a generation or two before it. So, my theory is, this Ganon really has nothing at the start besides his thirst for power, and the wisdom to bring his plans to fruition. This actually shows to me something of a more methodical and balanced Ganon, and to me, it could very well be the reason why this one can wield the full Triforce, no questions asked. But because of this, I place Four Swords Adventures here, but no longer because this is where he gets the trident.